So with that, what I want to spend the vast majority of today's session about is the four amazing panelists we have: Zarah, Kaushik, Chet, and Emily. So thank you all for being here. I have a couple questions prepared that we can go through. And then at the end, we can have whoever is in the class, you can ask whatever questions you want. But to start out with, I'm wondering if we just go in order here. So Zarah, then Kaushik, then Chet, then Emily. If you could share a little bit of an introduction about who you are, and also why did you pick Android as like your chosen career path? So I'll start there, and then I have a couple more questions after that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we can start with Zarah.
Oh, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Zarah. I'm an Android dev. I'm based in Sydney, Australia. How did I start with Android? I started with Android because I basically didn't have a choice. I didn't have any money. I only have a Windows laptop from work, so I can't do iOS. So I ended up doing Android. I actually started out my career as a hardware engineer, like I was doing, microprocessor chips and stuff. And there wasn't much pay in it. So I was like, oh, what should I do so that I could, keep on earning money, because I have to live and, buy things and that sort of stuff. And so I decided to shift to software development, because that never goes away, just evolves. So it's a constant thing. And yeah, it's interesting because I'm not actually a computer science student. I was a hardware and electrical student. So I'm an electronics and communications engineer by education. So that was a bit fun and challenging. And I ended up doing Android when the first public API came out, and I've been doing Android ever since.
Perfect. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but Zarah is actually in Australia. The other panelists are all Bay Area focused. So that was also very interesting if people are curious about the international aspect of Android. And then I just dropped in the chat, Zarah, I think the way I found out about you was through your blog, actually. There was something that came up, someone forwarded me. So that's how I reached out. Would recommend people check that out. Cool. And then next, I think Kaushik, go for it.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, folks, Zarah is amazing. There was this recent video, I think, that Google did. So there's you should share that YouTube link. That was pretty awesome. It talks about her story. So I was I've known Zarah for so long, but I was whoa, that video was amazing. So definitely go look at it. Anyway, hey, I'm Kaushik. I work as a senior staff engineer at Instacart. I work on what we call our shopper platform team. Like Rahul said, I'm in the Bay Area. I've been working as a software engineer, I guess, for about 15-ish years now, and as a mobile engineer for about 9 or 10 of those years. At Instacart now, I work on mostly our Android apps. So I take care of the shopper Android app. I also dabble a lot with our iOS app. So I'm mostly on the mobile side now, and then I work with both teams. Much like Zarah, I think I didn't necessarily pick Android. I worked at a startup before this. It was an app for weddings. So it was called Wedding Party. And at the time, I was actually a web engineer. So I did back-end, front-end. That was mostly what I did. They suckered me into joining. But after I joined, I happened to be the only person who knew Java. And we wanted to bring our Android app inside. Our Android app was getting a lot of traction. And so they wanted to basically bring that app into I think it was maintained by a contractor at the time. So they wanted to bring it in, and I was the only one who knew Java. So they were okay, hey, sounds like you automatically called a shotgun in this. So even though it was very accidentally, it was the best decision in that happened to me in my career. I think I didn't realize it when I had to take it up, because I was I don't want to work in Java. But little did I know that was definitely one of the best things that happened to me.
Amazing. So thanks, Kaushik, for being here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and embellish everyone who talked. So the way I found about Kaushik, like many Android developers, I think, is through the podcast that he created with someone named Don called Fragmented. So I left a link for that in the chat. But I think that has had a pretty huge impact, an outsized impact in the world of Android. So definitely, if you're serious about Android or just software best practices in general, would recommend checking out that podcast.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. And then Chet, go for it.
Okay, where do I start? So I joined the Android team at Google in 2010, and I have been there ever since. I've done various things on the team. I joined the Toolkit team to do basically graphic software there. I led the team for a while. I went over to developer relations to help out that team for a couple of years, and now I'm back in engineering, working on the graphics team. Like Kaushik and Zarah, and probably most software engineers, I didn't choose Android. It chose me because that's what the job was, right? I think what you can do is determine the areas you want to focus on, the domains that interest you, but the actual technologies you use there are not necessarily up to you. It's up to, whatever the company needs to be using, wherever the jobs are or whatever. So for me, ever since I went to grad school in the early 90s, it's been graphic software, and I'll work on whatever it is as long as it shows pixels on the screen. So I worked across Silicon Valley since '93 at Sun Microsystems, at Adobe, at Intel, at startups. But it was always about the graphics. And then in 2010, I joined the team basically to work on animation and graphic stuff. I don't know if I'm probably missing something I was supposed to say, but we'll maybe leave it there.
No, that's perfect. I love that. Again, let me embellish a little bit. So first off, I think Chet is really unique in that he's at the mothership at Google. So like any questions that we have about the maintainer and kind of manager of Android, then Chet is perfect. And also, he recently, in the past couple of months, I think, he published this book about the origin story of Android. So I linked that in the chat. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I keep seeing people post about it on Twitter, and they have a selfie with the book. So clearly, it is a very impactful book, and I'm actually looking forward to reading it as well. All right, Emily.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily. I am an Android developer at Uber. I build UI libraries for all the Android apps that we have at Uber. And I guess my story is similar to everyone else here. I don't know if you planned this, Rahul, when you're planning the panel. I didn't necessarily choose Android either. I went to Penn and studied neuroscience and classical studies. And after undergrad, I had no idea what I wanted to do, had one of those like super find myself moments, didn't eat, pray, love, anything like that. But instead I did CS50. I'm not sure if that's really the soul searching that most people do. After CS50, I went back to school and got a post-bac. Basically, I was taking all the undergraduate courses that you would have done in a computer science degree. Those courses were in Java, so similar to some other people's stories here. Once I had Java experience, I got an internship at Mozilla, and I was building Android browsers at Mozilla for a few years and ended up being one of like the lead maintainers of all of our open source Android libraries, and then moved to Uber pretty recently. So that's kind of my Android story.
Okay, amazing. And then again, so let me just add on, at least from my perspective, I think, Emily, you've done a really good job in terms of like putting yourself out there in commentary about the tech industry or Android, or just more broadly, like some of the things that we talk about, like socially in the tech industry. And I don't know, is TikTok your biggest platform, Emily? I don't know if it's TikTok or Twitter or what, but
yeah, somehow it's TikTok. I didn't try that. It just kind of happened, but I guess we're in a college class, so everyone here is probably familiar with TikTok. I do satire and comedic commentary about the tech industry. Anyway, I didn't really mention that, but thanks for bringing it up. But yeah, so not necessarily on Android stuff. So I think being in this panel, I'm kind of like, shoot, why am I here? These are all very distinguished Android engineers. I kind of think of Android as more of my day job, not as involved with it outside of work. But I mean, I think that's maybe still perspective, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I think it's a 100% valuable perspective. Emily, I linked your TikToks to people who are interested. They can check that out. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about the panel here is that we have a breadth of experience, not only in terms of like company size, but also country, what domain they've worked in before. So maybe I'll start with you, Chet. I'm just curious, how do you handle the rate of change in Android? I feel like one of the things that happens is like you have Java and then you migrate to Kotlin, and the kind of architecture, like the recommended architecture, the recommended tools everything about Android is constantly changing, or best practices keep evolving. Do you have any advice for students around how to keep up? Or is it maybe the answer is don't keep up, just do what you think is best for your business needs?
Good question. I mean, hopefully the rate of change is not what it was in the early days. Like in the early days, everybody was running really fast, doing as much as they could and building out really fundamental things. And now I think of the changes that we're doing as being a bit more incremental, because there's not as much that we need to do, because we're kind of there, right? The platforms that are out there for mobile kind of do what they need to do, and then there's new hardware features to take advantage of, or some of what we've been doing on the software side is looking at pain points and trying to fix those by introducing new things. You are seeing a couple of larger new things come out in the last couple of years, like the introduction of Kotlin 3 or 4 years ago when we adopted it. And Jetpack Compose just came out this last summer as the new way to do UI toolkit stuff. I wouldn't expect changes like that that are sort of larger and maybe a little harder to absorb immediately to be that frequent. It's more like, you know, when a platform reaches the age and maturity level of something like Android, occasionally you need to look at what you have and say, okay, what do we need to incrementally improve, and what do we need to basically put aside and do something fundamentally new? It is kind of hard to keep track of stuff, but I would say you don't need to think as a developer, oh, hey, they just came out with this new thing, now I have to rewrite my app. That's not the way we look at it. It's more like when you need to do new stuff, maybe there's an easier way for you to do that. So an example of that is Jetpack Compose. Like from day one, we built in the ability to integrate the new stuff with the old, so you can sort of migrate iteratively as you go. As you need new features, you can do the new stuff beside the old stuff, so you don't have to like wipe the slate clean and then reboot and rewrite everything, because A, who wants to do that, and B, who's going to pay for that effort, right? So I don't think you need to constantly think, oh, now I need to take, you know, the latest shiny and do that instead. It's more like, well, if you have a new thing to do, maybe it's worth a little bit of time to search out there and see whether there's a new way to do that people are fans of, as opposed to the traditional classic way.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So have it be driven more by what you need to do. And if there's a solution that makes your life easier, then you can adopt it, rather than starting with a solution, start with the problem instead. I like that framing. Anyone else on that? Like how do you keep up to date? How do you, Fragmented, I think, Kaushik, it started off as an Android podcast, right? And kind of is now a little bit broader, but I'm wondering if you could talk about that. How do you stay up to date on Android?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll say this though, like the fear of becoming like irrelevant is very real in tech. It's a fear that I very much also had. I do think I'm a little lucky because the podcast helps a lot with this. I can just get really smart folks, like, a lot of the panelists here also have been on the podcast. I just ask them questions and I make sure I listen and learn from them, and that helps. But the other aspect of it is I feel, alluding to like what Chet said, I think with time and experience, my opinions also are changing. I feel like you don't necessarily always have to be at the bleeding edge, right? Like there's this need to always want to know like the most, the latest, the hottest thing. But I don't actually think like that's as long as, companies like Instacart, Uber, Square, like Google, they don't necessarily care that you're using the latest technology as long as you're able to provide value. Right. So if you're able to sort of like write software that provides value, I think that usually ends up like being the more important thing. And the silver lining of like tech changing so rapidly is I think that it changes for everyone. Right. So you just, if you wait for like 6 months, like you probably have to like refresh your knowledge. So it doesn't matter, like in a year, you have to refresh your knowledge anyway. Right. So I think that's the silver lining of things changing so fast. I think the most important thing, at least personally, that I've found is, you just have to be curious to learn. Like, if you're curious to learn the new stuff, like when you're thrown a problem, you will learn what's needed. And I think you'll find your way there.
And then Emily and Zarah, I'm wondering if one of you could comment, like when you're actually working as an Android developer in one of these companies, as an app, like a product developer, an app developer, at what point do you decide to adopt the hot new thing versus is there like a decision framework, like architecture review internally and how you make that decision?
For me, yes, because I think like what Kaushik said, when I was younger, when I was starting Android, I felt like I had to know everything. And now I'm kind of like on a need to know basis, as I tell my team. So yeah, like usually as what Chet said is what I practically apply in the app I work on. So I work on a supermarket app, and we have a fairly large audience it's a supermarket app in Australia. So it's kind of like it's a balance of, if we need a new feature, like is this something that we can help with? So it doesn't, what I kind of do now is I'm aware of the things that can help me, but that doesn't necessarily mean like I know exactly how to do it. So when like a new feature comes in and we need to do something, I was like, oh, like I've heard about this thing. So, and that's usually enough. Like I've heard about this thing that can help us do this feature or this task. And then I deep dive into like, does this actually work? Like how difficult would it be to integrate with what we have now? Our app is fairly old in terms of like app years. I guess it's almost like 7 years old. So there's a lot of like, old code and really new code that's in there. So a lot of balancing. And I guess that's one of the things that comes with age. I'm carbon dating myself, but yeah, it's one of those things that come with experience, that you kind of sort of get a feel of what would be a good balance between integrating old and new stuff together.
And I guess I'll add on to that, that I think I agree with a lot of the other speakers on the panel. Luckily or unluckily, like this isn't really a problem that's unique to Android, right? So no matter what part of the tech world you're working in, there's going to be new technologies coming out, new libraries that you might have to learn, changes, deprecated things, etc. So it's something that you're going to have to be aware of working in tech in general. But I think as some of the more seasoned panelists, that was not a snide comment about age, have mentioned as well, like a lot of them didn't even start their careers in Android because it didn't exist, right? So yeah. You kind of always have to be ready for the new thing, but it doesn't mean that you have to be on top of everything as it's coming out, right? It just means that the skills that you are using today might help you with something that's down the line 5 or 10 years from now. But in my opinion, it's not something to worry about on the daily. And the changes while they're happening are much slower than like looking at the big scale of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, in that you can't predict, Android might look very different 5 years from now. There's new platforms, new frameworks. So I think one thing that a lot of people in the class are still actually figuring out, if they even want to be a software engineer, let alone an Android engineer. So I'm curious, anyone can take this, but how, if you could start over and you were like a Stanford senior graduating now, would you recommend, would you want to be an Android developer coming out of college? Like if you could start over, graduating in the job industry, how would you think about like what field within software engineering you want to be in? Does that question make sense? Anyone can take it.
Yeah, I could answer that. I would, because I think the ecosystem now is very different from what it was when I was starting. Like now there's so many, like resources, or so many blog posts, so much podcasts, documentation, code labs, all those kinds of things, that makes it like much easier to go into software than, because when Android was beginning, everyone's kind of like just guessing and figuring things out as we go along. So I think now it's much easier. And, like I guess with the pandemic, what I've seen for myself from my experience here in Australia is like, it's one of the more stable jobs, I think, because, you can work anywhere basically. Yeah, it's always exciting because, always something new comes out. You can see it as like, oh my God, there's another new thing. But it's also like, oh my God, there's another new thing. So, it's always exciting. There's always something new. It's a continuous learning thing. So if that's your kind of thing that you always want to be, undergo learning new things, I think software is like really exciting. And I don't regret shifting to it at all.
And particularly for Android, I'll just add that I think I would also choose Android again, if only just because the people in the community have been very nice, very helpful. I always say in my career, I just want to work with like smart, nice people. Like I don't really care as much about necessarily the actual problems I'm solving or what I'm using to solve those problems. I really want to work with a nice community of people around me. And I've really found that in the Android community.
I'll jump in here. I always have an opinion. I'm not religious about software or things that I do at all. I've done so many things in my career, and I think all of them are helpful. You learn from all of it. I think the main thing is doing software. I would totally choose that again. I think of it, we call it a science. It's totally not a science. We're making this crap up. I think of it as a very creative endeavor as we try to figure out how to solve problems that we don't know how to solve yet. Right? We're constantly just going through these mind games and puzzles. And I love puzzles. So software, yes. Android, yes, it's one of the interesting and dynamic areas of the field right now, which I think makes it attractive. I think there are other ones as well. I think I wouldn't single out anyone specifically as like, I need to do that thing. I think that anybody can learn anything from any job that you get. I think the main thing is landing on that job and working, understand what it means to work on a team, to work on a backward and forward compatible code base, to work with others and drive toward a project. Like there's really important life and software engineering skills that have nothing to do with the domain that we're in. Having said that, if you happen to land on an Android project, great, because it's a really dynamic part of the computer ecosystem right now. And it's a good place to be. It's kind of weird after a career spent working on stuff that nobody saw in the real world to be an Android where people see the stuff that you're working on all over the planet on billions of phones every day. That is kind of cool. But, there's many opportunities out there.
I can touch on like one aspect of the question that you asked, right? Which is like, okay, do you pick Android? Like if like, given you've chosen software, do you pick Android or do you pick something else? I've had moments where I'm like, I genuinely hate being an Android developer. And then I've had moments where I was like, I would do nothing else. Like, it is kind of like a mixed bag. And I think like the important thing though is like, do you enjoy, and I think Chet maybe mentioned this, right? Like if as long as you're willing to learn, I think that's the important thing, right? Like if you love doing what you do, there are days when I'm like, okay, this project that I'm working on an Android app, I absolutely would like stay up the whole night working on, because I just enjoy it. I think those are the aspects. If you happen to be bitten by that bug where you're like, I genuinely enjoy doing what I do, and someone's willing to pay for it, I mean, hell yeah, like, go for it.
So zooming in then on the Android side of it, let's say, okay, I'm a student and I decided I really want to just pursue Android. One of the questions I often get from students at the end of 194A is, what should I spend my time on? Should I go deeper in Kotlin and really learn the language? Should I do a personal project and publish it to the Play Store? Should I do open source? Sometimes the barrier to entry to like contributing to a library is quite high. If I wanted to be like a successful Android engineer like all of you, what would you recommend that students do if they really want to learn Android properly?
I can maybe throw a quick point and then I'll let the others talk about this because I'm more curious to hear their answers. I think the important thing is, actually, you know what, I'm going to wait because I feel my answer might sort of like dampen the mood a little. So like, I'll wait for the others and then I'll come back. I'll follow up.
Okay.
So I think the best way to learn a lot of things in Android is to just build things. And so whenever I am trying to learn, a new architecture or maybe a new library that came out, I'm always just trying to build like sample apps, and that can take a lot of time. But I interviewed last year, like to get a new job. And one of the things I was trying to brush up on was like all the contemporary architecture patterns that maybe I hadn't been working on in my day job, which is kind of silly when you think about it, like learning to interview, but whatever. And yeah, I think one of the main things I was doing was just building sample apps. And like, there's some pretty, easy things that you can build that are just pulling data, displaying the data, like doing some funky things, switching screens, and just making sure that like you're learning by doing. And I think that's a really great way to just like play around with new things. But yes, to everything you said, like, I don't think there's necessarily like a wrong way to learn. If you like reading blogs, or you like doing tutorials, or you like contributing to open source, like those are all valid things to do as well.
I'll jump in. I don't see Zarah's mic unmuting. So I've always found it easiest to learn things if I have a goal. So I agree with what Emily was just saying. Like, for sample apps, I would say, you know what I'd really like is an app that did the following, and that will force you to learn everything you need to know. And you pull this thread and it pulls 10 other ones. And then you end up chasing down all this information in order to get to that original goal. And maybe the goal changes, maybe it expands, maybe it drops, whatever, but it forces you to learn things in a way where you can actually use that knowledge, as opposed to, I could read a bunch of articles and I understand it at the time, but if I'm not integrating that information into something I'm trying to do, it's probably going to be paged out of my brain pretty quickly. And as far as open source, I think that's fantastic. But I think if you're just trying to learn an area, it's kind of hard to know, like, well, what are you going to help with? Or if you just jump on some random open source project, maybe you're going to learn a little bit more about that, but do you understand the context for why it was built or how it would integrate, or is it teaching you broader stuff? I would say at the point where you're getting out of college, trying to learn a new thing, sort of trying to learn a little bit more broadly what that context is and how the pieces fit together to build an app is probably, at least in the Android or mobile space in general, is probably a little more important than going deep in a specific area to help people who need a framework for doing XYZ. I think that's stuff that develops a little bit later when, okay, you've been working on Android or whatever for a while and you realize, like a lot of the friends that I have at Square do this, where they're like, oh, you know what we really need is a facility for doing XYZ. And then they go off and they build an open source library for doing that because they identified the need first. First they came up with the hammer and then they looked for the nail. Or did I get that backwards? Anyway.
No, that's a great point. So yeah, go ahead.
And sorry.
Yeah.
One thing I would say is be patient with yourself, because there's so many things out there. And people learn differently. Like, I think like Chet and Emily, I learned by doing. So that's usually what I like. If something comes up that I need to do, I learn about it and then I write about it, because when I write about it, that kind of sticks in my head better. And also I forget things a lot. So if I write something about it in my blog, that's actually how I started my blog. When I started learning Android, I write down the things that I've learned so that I can reference it in the future. And that happens a lot because, there's just so many things that I have a tiny brain, so things get pushed out all the time, so just be patient with yourself. And I guess try to figure out the best way you learn, because some people like watching videos or read something and then they learn it. I can't do that. I have to actually use it. Building something, figuring out how to do it, and just figuring out how it sticks to you better, I think is the best way to learn. Yeah. So don't pressure yourself into learning everything, because there's just too much. There's no way.
I can just cap it off at the end with because I was thinking about when I joined and I was like, I had no idea what I was doing. I'm right out of college. The thing that really worked well for me is just finding interesting people to learn from. So either find a really good team, a team that's you've talked to each and every member and you feel like you can learn. The most I've learned has always been from either a really smart team that just pushes me to learn and get stuff done, or it's finding mentors, right? It's just I know this person just has wisdom, I'll just keep going to them and talking the problem with them. I don't think in any by any stretch of the imagination I would have strategically thought, okay, hi, I should be starting with Android, let me pick Android as my technology. I just got really lucky, and I think I was nudged always by either really strong team members or really strong mentors. So that would be my suggestion. If it doesn't matter if they're asking you to work on C or C++ and it's a J and I integration, which is personally my worst sort of experience with mobile development, I'd say still go for it, because if the team is strong and they know what they're doing, you'll learn a lot of snippets along the way.
Yeah, that's so true. I feel like a lot of the decisions I've made in my career have been much more people-driven rather than technology-driven. And I think that has definitely served me well.
I also just wanted to add something quickly. If you're getting your first job out of undergrad, no one's expecting you to be an Android expert. So let's just get that out of the way right there. You don't need to know everything about Android to get your first job.
I wanted to jump into something that Kaushik ended with about like, maybe they're asking you to do this thing, which I find, personally reprehensible. That is totally fine. Like the first job I got out of undergrad is a job that I ended up hating. And I actually found it to be a really good experience because it helped me learn the things that I didn't want to do, which I think is just as important as learning things that you do want to do are really important technical experience. And so there's always something to learn from an experience, whether it's an experience that you want to keep doing or not. I think the important thing is just to get out there and do something. And the more that you do that thing, the more you learn about yourself and the domain, and then make better, more informed career decisions after that.
100%. So I have a couple more questions, but let me ask one, and then I'll pause to see if anyone else in the room wants to ask the question. But the one that I wanted to do right now is, what is something that you like or dislike that was kind of surprising to you about Android? So like Emily, you mentioned the community. And I think in my experience as well, the community has been fantastic. There's a lot of people who are there to support you in Android, even if they don't know you. There's like a Slack group called Android Study Group. And there's a ton of helpful people there. So I think community overall has been great. Kaushik, you mentioned that there were a couple of things that you really didn't like about Android or that has bitten you in the past. So just curious if anyone on the panel can share something that they found surprising about Android.
I think the thing I found surprising, which is good, is that you can actually talk to the engineers who are building Android, which I don't see it happening in other fields in software. Particularly when I was beginning Android, so this was like super early days, right? Like I go on Stack Overflow because I'm working by myself, like in those days, like you only have one Android developer in a company because there are no other Android developers. So like when I don't know how to do something, I ask on Stack Overflow, and like Android engineers actually answer my question. That was back, I guess when they have time to answer Stack Overflow questions, because the community was much smaller. But that's really how I learned. Like the community is really, really good. Everyone's really out to help everyone. And yeah, I think just having access to the Google engineers, and like if you go to, I guess when we have I/O back or the Android Developer Summit back, just having the privilege to attend those conferences and talk to like the Android engineers is really valuable to me, because I wouldn't have imagined when I was starting Android that like one day when I actually have a problem, I can ask them about it, and there are like thousands of people who can help me. Because when in the beginning, it was really lonely. I felt so alone. But yeah, it's surprising because like when you're a lowly developer, you think of this, the people who built Android are like out there and they're like really smart people. But if you can actually get to talk to them and get to know them as people, they're actually really nice.
Yeah, and I find it surprising that people outside of the team would want to talk to us. So there's two sides to that coin.
Always, Chet, especially you, Chet.
I do want to stress that difference, right? So like the community, like one thing that's like really nice that I think Emily and Zarah touched on is like the Android community, right? This is like, okay, hey, there's like Slack groups, there's like, Reddit or whatever, like, you can like reach out to people, and generally the Android community tends to be nice. But I can't stress that point enough, like where Google itself, and I can like, I'm not saying this just because Chet's on this panel, Google is really like receptive to these changes, right? There's like this other company that we will not name, which doesn't necessarily always like land up being very receptive. Like I know like of many conversations that we have had, like, or I've seen happening with Google engineers, which they take back. And then, a year later, you see those changes in like Android, right? Like these are changes that you like, in many ways you could feel like you were a part of, because you're like, hey, this is a pain point. We need this pain point. Can we like see this happen? And it actually does happen. Like that's just been fascinating. Like, I've not seen that happen in too many other, like in other communities. So I think like that aspect where it's like, okay, the general public outside, but also like, the interface to Google where like we can make that happen within Google, like that also is like pretty valuable. Like that isn't something that I've seen pretty often.
Chet, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see it from the other side where it is really important to us to get that feedback, because we're creating this platform that, more and more is something that so many people depend on, whether you are developers making your living at it or doing hobby stuff, or the many users that are using it. And we want to make sure that we're actually making the right decisions, especially when we get into areas like, hey, it seems a little difficult to develop the UI for applications. Wouldn't it be nice if we improve that? Well, we have some ideas from the inside, but we're not the people writing the applications. And so it's really important to the Android team to actually go and talk to the community and say, help us understand. And the really nice thing is everybody wants to have that conversation with us, right? Like it's taking their time and energy and attention to give us that reasoned feedback to say, okay, well, here are some problems that I hit. And then we, can iterate with them, whether it's in online forums or conferences, some of the ones that Zarah mentioned, or wherever, or, the Slack groups. But we want to have those conversations. Like, it's not a constant conversation, because otherwise there'd be no time to actually type in the code. But going out with ideas and saying, hey, we'd like to do the following things. Can you have a conversation with us and help us understand? Because you can tell us the pain points you're hitting in your application development process that we don't understand, we don't see from inside the development of the API. So it is a two-way street that I think is really powerful. I like being a part of it on that other side too, that Google and Android are very open to us being a part of the community, because I think we all do better from it, both the community, the developers, the users, as well as the platform itself.
Yeah, I'll add one data point there. I definitely appreciate the open source and collaborative nature of Android. Like, I work at Facebook or Meta, and I mean, maybe we're unique in that, we have these enormous Android apps, but there's actually a working group within the company, and a big part of their job is actually collaborating with Google. And they have, I don't know like how frequently, but like I think like a monthly meeting or a bi-weekly meeting with the Android team. And that kind of just shows you that, that kind of thing, I haven't really heard that happen with Apple or iPhone. So I just feel like that's kind of a really powerful thing about Android. Does anyone want to share anything negative? Or we can just all say positive things about Android.
Oh, I'd totally do it.
Chet is here, so.
Yeah, go for it, Kaushik.
So I will say this, and it's sort of like a dual-edged sword. Like, one thing I have noticed is like Android developers care a lot about like architectures and like, building clean software, but that came out of necessity. And like, hey, I love Chet. I love like all the great stuff he's doing, and like his team is doing. But in the early days, Android was brutal, and I think some of those consequences are that the Android engineers are like, we need to come up with architectures. Like, very rarely, like having worked with both iOS and Android like teams, I've noticed iOS teams don't care that much about architecture. And it's not because necessarily I'm like poo-pooing them in an Android panel. I don't think they've had to, and which I think might, you can take it for what it is. In the early days, it was far easier to build an iOS app, right? Like, because there were less sort of like, there was the breadth of devices that you had to like cover was much more limited. Like, now you can say, like, I don't think that's the case anymore. Like, iOS is also starting to like, face a lot of the same problems that like a lot of Android engineers in the early days sort of had to face and like circumvent. That being said, it's like much rosier now, but that's just like a side effect I've noticed. It made us stronger. It made the Android engineers like stronger, but at the same time, the early days were like pretty like even I think to this point, like if you had to go back and support really urgent early versions of Android, that's like hard to do. Granted, that's not something like thankfully that a lot of other apps have to do, but I know Rahul, like at Meta or Facebook, like I've heard like horror stories of like having to support from like version like API 2 or whatever it is, and I'm like, oh my god, I do not want to be doing that. That is not fun. Like
if you've ever had to fix a bug on like a random Samsung or Huawei device that's showing up in your crash logs, like I think that's like one of the worst days I've had on Android. When you're like, oh my god, like the ecosystem's just so fragmented, right, with the hardware that people are using, and a lot of people, are rooting their phones and doing random OSs. And yeah, like sometimes you can just, ignore those people, but if it becomes a big enough problem, then it becomes the team's problem. So I think that is a huge negative of Android, I guess, and a positive, like that the hardware ecosystem is open, but at the same time, as the developers, it's kind of your problem too.
Yeah,
And
big plus one.
I just want to, sorry, go ahead, Rahul.
No, go ahead. No, Kaushik, please go for it.
I just want to like echo this point because like Emily also like reminded me of like another like story, because I think like that's one of the things, right? The beauty of Android is it's like open, so you have many variants. Like you can go into like, you know, a Walmart or something and pick up like, you know, I think a $20 or $10 devices. And a lot of people use this, like, especially in the gig economy, like, you know, so Emily probably sees this a lot as at, you know, at Uber too, but at Instacart too, we see like, we, you know, as a developer, like it's my job to make sure that like the app that I release works as well on like these $20 devices and like, you know, the $600 or $700 devices. On that side of the spectrum, it's easier, but on the $10 or $20 side, it lands up being a little like difficult, you know? So that's the flip side. But again, I think that is an opportunity because like, you know, you as the developer, if you're able to crack that, then you're in a position of like, you have that advantage. You know, so like that's the other way to look at it.
I like this. Okay, so students can get both the good and bad, or what could use improvement in Android. So everyone is clear-eyed as they come into it.
Yeah, so I was pre-med. Both my parents were doctors, so it was always just like you're gonna do this. And as I kind of became like a junior, I was like, I really like sleeping. I'm not sure really like medicine's for me. And my parents were supportive, but worried. And then when I started picking up computer science stuff, I think everyone kind of assumed that I would be working in like bioinformatics or doing something at like the intersection of neuroscience and computer science. And yeah, to be honest, I still really am interested in science, but I think it was always more of an interest rather than like a career for me. And I tried working in like 4 different wet labs doing neuroscience research. It was just never for me. That being said, I think there are opportunities to combine those two things. So if you're interested, there's even things like you could combine Android and neuroscience, right? Like I know there's probably some Stanford labs that need an Android app to do autism research or something. Like I've seen jobs like that. So I think in tech, there's so many opportunities to do crossovers between different disciplines or fields that you're interested in. And that's like a huge opportunity, but no regrets.
Awesome. While we wait. All right, thanks, Emma. Yeah, and while we wait for more student questions, I have one that I really wanted to ask. And maybe we can start with Chet here. Cross-platform development, React Native, Flutter, PhoneGap, Xamarin, there's so many things out there. And I think many students, they come in, they say, I want to build an app for both Android and iOS. So of course, you know, that might be, it looks like it might be more appealing. So I would love to understand from all of your perspective, how bullish are you or pessimistic are you maybe on the future of cross-platform? And in particular, Chet, maybe with Flutter, because Flutter is actually developed by Google. So in late 2021, would you recommend that students spend their time actually learning a lot about these cross-platform technologies like Flutter, or should they kind of stick with native?
It depends on what your goal is. I should be really clear. Flutter is developed at Google. It is not developed on the Android team. So I'm actually not the best person to ask about Flutter, except the architecture itself is really interesting. In fact, when the team that I was leading at the time was the toolkit team who decided, hey, we need a new way of doing this stuff. And we basically looked at what was going on in Flutter and said, that's an interesting architecture. And we adopted that React approach, which is kind of where Jetpack Compose started from, right? So the programming model itself is really interesting. We took it in a different direction. We wanted to base it on Kotlin, and it made various other fairly large changes along the way. But like the cross-platform, the idea of cross-platform development has been kind of a pipe dream for many years, and it kind of continues to be so. Will we get there eventually one day? I don't know. I mean, the web kind of got there for PCs. In mobile platforms, there's still a pretty huge advantage for getting a good mobile experience by using what the native platforms are, as opposed to something that is going to be kind of dumbed down to least common denominator. I think a lot of them end up being a quick way to get to market. So that's kind of getting back to my original point of like, what is your main goal? Is it to, quickly have an app that's everywhere, or is it to sort of focus on getting the quality app in these different places? I think what we see in general is the more mature companies with mature applications are going to be having native apps, and people that are either new or, they're shops that help people get an app out there as soon as possible. Maybe it's temporary or it's just quickly delivered or whatever. Maybe they're looking at some of the cross-platform solutions. You probably want to talk to some of the app developers on the panel, though, since obviously I have somewhat of a subjective viewpoint on the topic.
Yeah, anyone from the product side, please chime in.
So I did work on an app that has both. And I think the answer really, and I think this happens a lot in software, is it depends. So it depends on your use case. It depends on how fast you want to get things out. But I think what's really important is to always weigh the pros and cons of doing something. So our app is largely native, but there are some things like it's a form, and people just fill out that form. Maybe a cross-platform solution would be enough for that, because there's not really a lot of user interaction. People fill it in and submit it, and then it's gone. So for those purposes, if you want to get it out, sure, no worries about using a cross-platform solution for that. Now, which cross-platform solution? Because now there's a lot. It also depends on your team, because each of those the platforms you mentioned, PhoneGap, Xamarin, Flutter, React Native, they require different levels of support from the people who are going to be maintaining that thing. So in our app we started with React Native, and it's pretty simple in the beginning, and then as you go along you realize, oh, there's actually this negative thing or this one, or oh, it's getting really hard. And then so at some point we decided okay, you know what, it's not worth it anymore, let's just go back to native. So it really depends on how much effort, I guess, you want to spend on something. Yeah, but there's no issues with doing that, I think, is my point. If you need to, go for it.
Very similar to the other approaches. I will say this, that question comes up often, right? People keep asking, hey, should I do this or this? It isn't binary, right? Both can coexist. And I think another way to think about this is eventually when companies mature too, there are certain requirements where certain portions of the app don't necessarily need the polish or the finesse of a native app, right? If, like Zarah was saying, if it's a form, spending engineering time, having both an iOS engineer and an Android engineer working and spending time and pushing this update to build a form is not necessarily the most pragmatic, right? So in those cases, maybe you can have a web view. You can either use Flutter, and a lot of these technologies today, one of the main sort of attributes or characteristics is that they can coexist with native apps, right? So that's totally an option too. But eventually the answer is it depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on do you have the expertise, right? If you're a startup with 4 developers and all of them only know are web engineers who work on React Native is probably a good choice there, right? You want to be able to move fast. If you're a startup that's 2 people and you're going to grow to 50 people and you want to be an attractive place to work for, if you tell them I'm working on a native C++ app with the JNI interface, you're going to have a hard time finding people to work, right? So again, that's the kind of thing where hey, I'm working on Kotlin and we have a Jetpack Compose app. You'll watch those applications drop pretty fast. So it depends. It depends on the team constituency, how many engineers. It depends on where the team's going to go. It depends on what your app requires. There's a lot of these things, but I feel this binary thing of oh, should I do X or Y? No, do both. That's at least my opinion.
Yeah, I think a lot of native developers can be a little snobby about these cross-platform approaches, right? You hear oh, this app's made up of a bunch of web views or something, and everyone gets a little upset. But I think everyone else was saying, it really depends on the problem case. And I think there's also some newer cross-platform tech solutions that are interesting, like Kotlin multi-platform. Still have to get the iOS engineers to kind of buy into, maybe using some Kotlin libraries. But I think that's, a really interesting approach. And obviously the value prop is there, right? Let's write something once, let's save time. If it works out for the team and if there's enough expertise and if there's time to, invest in these new technologies. But I agree with everything everyone else was saying too.
Yeah, I feel in general, when you have smart people disagree on something, the answer is not one or the other. There's always some nuance behind it? Or the answer is almost always, it depends. That's kind of a good rule of thumb that I found, is that, it's never that simple. I have one more that I would love to get perspective on, which is content creation. The four of you are pretty well known in the community, and in some form or another, you've been very deliberate about creating content. Kaushik, you have the Fragmented podcast. Zarah with the blog. Chet, you've written a number of books. And Emily, obviously, you're pretty active on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. So I'm just wondering how you all think about that. Like, is that something that you plan out, or like it's a passion project? How does it relate to your career? Like, just wondering what advice would you have to people on if that's something that other people should also consider, but whatever form content creation looks for them. What would you say about that?
I'll start because I feel like mine's the least serious content creation and everyone else can go into more of the technical stuff. Mine's definitely more of just like a creative outlet. And I think it's great for people to just like be yourself online. And it's always, well, not always, it hasn't always been positive, but I would say overwhelmingly positive to, be known in the community, and definitely have gotten opportunities that way. Obviously I'm here, that's an opportunity. Thanks for inviting me. But yeah, I've always seen positives from, being out there and creating content. But yeah, for me, more of just like a creative outlet and trying to like rant about SF culture, basically.
My motivation for creating content is really just for myself. Because I don't want to forget things. Because, like if I'm learning things and then I spent so much time figuring something out, I don't want to forget it. So I write it down. So, and like I usually forget stuff. So I just want something to go back to. Because I know, in Android, it's really just all apps are just a bunch of things that are very similar. You get a bunch of data from the web, you display it on the app. Like, all Android apps are basically just that. So, a lot of things you have to do over and over again. So, that's why I write stuff. I don't put any pressure on myself to, oh my God, I haven't blogged in a while, I have to write something. So I usually write something that I am working on. So you can actually figure out what I'm working on by the entries in my blog. So if I write about something, that's probably because I'm working on it for the app I work on. But yeah, like I think content creation is different for everyone. It's, like everyone's unique. So it's also like just, I guess, figuring out like what is comfortable for you, but also like you don't have to create content if you don't feel like it. Because, like just forcing yourself to do something, it usually it's not fun. So yeah, like if I wanna share something that like, oh my God, like this is actually pretty interesting and someone might learn. I write about it, and then I don't really worry about like if somebody has written about it before already, because somebody has probably written about something before already. But yeah, it doesn't matter because I write for myself basically. So I don't care if others have written about it before.
Yeah, let me just add in before we go to Chet or Kaushik. I 100% agree. Sorry, like I feel like teaching is learning. So like when you write a blog or I make content on YouTube, like when you're able to describe a technical concept and explain it, I feel like there's so much benefit for you. So the reason I do it is because it's kind of a selfish thing. Like I've got a bunch of benefit from learning about Android or whatever I'm teaching about. Chet or Kaushik, you want to add anything here?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, like the same points, right? Like, I think putting out content, like, especially like the podcast has been like one of the best things, at least for me, like for my career. I will say this too, it isn't as easy as like, it isn't that easy either. Like having good content, like it takes work. And so if you're not enjoying it, like, yeah, like the other, like Zarah and Emily were saying, like, if you don't enjoy it, like, don't force yourself to do it. But it's very rewarding. Like, I think that's the aspect of it that, if you can get past the effort to like, get into like a somewhat of a decent cadence, it's extremely rewarding, both in terms of access, because like, and again, like going back to like the blog, like Zarah, like when I started the podcast, I don't think anyone knew of like, nobody knew who I was. a couple of blog posts that I wrote happened to catch the eye of one of my co-hosts. And so when I wanted to start a podcast, I cold emailed my co-host, Don, who I think has also been in the panel. And he's like, oh yeah, I've read some of your blog posts and like, hey, maybe this could work. So, those kind of things, those opportunities open up when you're able to put that content. So when you put the effort, the reward is definitely there. So that's there. But yeah, I mean, if your objective is like, okay, I need to only do this and I hate my life for doing this, don't do it. Like, because very quickly people will start to tell from the content too, right? So I think that's what I've learned from like this entire process. And by the way, Chet has not just written books. He had his podcast even before ours, and it's an amazing podcast. Everyone should listen to it. And he's like done the full gamut. He's spoken like on like, he regularly speaks on the stage. So I'm curious to hear his like sort of view like from the content perspective.
And that podcast, is that Android Backstage, Chat, or which one are you talking about? Yeah, okay.
Android Developers Backstage. Yep. Yeah, I guess that was the segue. So I feel guilty. I feel that content production is a totally selfish thing in a couple of ways. So yeah, so we've got this podcast totally competing with Fragmented. I think we're obviously enemies competing for the same audience. I feel like I get as much or more benefit out of doing the podcast as any of the listeners, in that I get to have a conversation with smart and interesting people, and I get to learn a bunch of stuff. And then along the way, people who happen to listen to the podcast, hopefully they learn at the same time. Right. Somebody substituted for me in some show a few years ago, and he said, oh, and I played the idiot like you do, so I could ask these questions. I'm like, I'm not playing an idiot. I am an idiot. That's what makes the podcast work, because I don't know this stuff. And so I ask the questions that help me learn it. And it's really fun for me. That's selfish. And then on the writing and the videos and the talk side, that comes from two angles. Again, totally personal. I don't do it because it gives me access and it gives me exposure. I think those things are true. I think that it raises your visibility and gives you some opportunities, but I wouldn't do it if I didn't want to. I enjoy two aspects. One is I enjoy comedy. So I enjoy, whether it's stand-up or improv or just writing comedy, I really enjoy trying to express an idea in a way that can make people at least smile. Or even groan, that's fine too. And so some of the content is around that, like, how can I express this idea in an entertaining way, whether it's a technical book or a humor book. And then on the other side, I really enjoy the process of taking deeply technical content and articulating in a way that makes people A, understand, and B, care. And that's really at the heart of a lot of the articles and books and talks that I've done is, here's something deeply technical about Android, about graphics, about software, about whatever. And here's a way to express it in a way that keeps people in the room awake, because you're doing it in hopefully an engaging way, and also helps them understand it through, just the way that you're explaining it, the way that you're sort of connecting the dots in what could be a really dry topic, but hopefully is not, depending on how you do it. So totally selfish. I think that people should be, if you're going to create good content, do it from a selfish perspective because you want to. Otherwise, you probably have something better that you can do with your time that you would enjoy more.
And I just want to do a big +1 to what you said at the end, Chet, around taking something deeply technical and making it accessible to a broader set of people. I feel like some of the smartest people I know are not, like some of the most senior people I know here at Facebook are not the most senior because they're doing the most complicated thing, but they're doing it, whatever they're doing, they're making it accessible to a lot more people. Like they're creating a framework where they're doing something which makes it my life easier, or they explain something to me. So now I get it. It's a light bulb moment. So I feel like that's such a deep skill that I think a lot of engineers, you have to work at it. You have to kind of really be deliberate about exercising that skill. And I think there's a huge amount of value for a company if you can cultivate that.
Just building on that point, Rahul, like that is so valuable. Like, one of the best advice I got from one of my professors was like, the most valuable thing, the thing that'll make you most valuable at a company, especially in like the software engineering side, is your ability to clearly communicate with people who don't understand the tech, right? Because after a certain point, and I've noticed this with a lot of companies, right? Like some of the biggest companies in the Valley, it's exactly what you said. people like, if you want to like, if you want to get onto a trajectory where like your growth is rising, your ability to clearly communicate with both people within like within like, if are you able to communicate clearly with other Android engineers, with other iOS engineers, with other backend engineers, like, within the platform, within the like sort of IC track as they call it, but also outside of that, like, like the other leaders, like who don't necessarily work with code. If you're able to communicate to them, communicate with them in a very clear way, that makes you incredibly valuable at like these companies.
100% agree. Okay, so let me just pause right now if you have any final question from anyone in the audience. Otherwise, I would love for each of us to just go around kind of parting words of wisdom. What career advice would you give to the students here about, as either a graduating or maybe they're, in the middle of their CS degree? What advice would you have that you wish someone had told you when you were in college? So how about we start with Zarah?
When I was in college, well, I don't know. I think the best advice I would give to anyone is to allow yourself to make mistakes. And like, just if you feel like you're not having fun, like it's totally okay to stop and be like, wait, is this really what I wanted to do? Like when I went to uni for 5 years, I studied electronics engineering, and I was like, oh my God, I've invested so much time and money and effort into learning that. I took the board exam. I'm a licensed engineer. I've spent so much time, and like, I feel like I owed it to my, being Asian, I felt like I owed it to my parents to stay in that career path that I've chosen. But yeah, I wasn't happy. It wasn't something that I enjoyed doing. So, just it may be difficult and it's challenging, and it may not be for everyone because we all have different circumstances. But yeah, allowing yourself to stop and be like, I'm not happy here. Is this what I wanted to do? And just giving yourself time to figure out what it is you want to do. Because I started my software career in mobile. I left mobile. I went to backend. I didn't like it, and then I ended up in Android. So even if you're in the same field, like software is such a vast field. There's so many different things you can do. So yeah, just giving yourself time to figure out what makes you happy and enjoy what you're doing, because you're definitely going to be the best at what you do if you enjoy what you're doing. Yes.
I love it. Kaushik, maybe we can go to you. We can go alphabetical, just like we did with intros.
Okay. So I'll give one like philosophical piece of advice and one very tactical piece of advice. The philosophical one is one of the best advice, again, and I think I tweeted this recently, like after somebody else did, is a professor, like when I was in school, like, this was a chemistry class that I did extremely like poorly, but that lesson was the most valuable thing in my entire career. So like, I think he said it was, maybe it was Newton or someone who said this, I'm willing to look foolish if it means I'll learn something. That by and large has been the most valuable advice I've gotten throughout my career. Like, almost like every engineer I know has always felt this at some point of time. At least they've told me that, where they're like, I fear that if I ask this question, I'll start looking stupid, right? People would have a much poorer impression of like my skill. That is complete BS. Like, the minute you just flip that switch and you're like, I don't care, I'm going to look foolish because I would rather learn than like look, give others the impression that I'm knowledgeable. That is just like, you'll immediately start to see your like you'll start to learn more, and that will like pay dividends in like larger ones. That's the philosophical one. The more specific or tactical one is with programming. I think polyglot programmers tend to be really valuable. And so don't limit yourself to like, oh, I love this language and therefore my entire career will only be like, in this language. Like just, go out there, learn different things, try different things. Even if you come back, like Zarah was saying, the beauty with having tried different languages is it sort of like shapes your mental model a little. So like even in the things that you do, like, the whole Jetpack Compose, like the reactive sort of thing, a lot of that was adapted from like what we saw on the web, right? Like, the Redux, React Natives of the world, a lot of like the way Android apps are built today are shaped from some of those ideas. So a lot of the people who took that leap of faith to learn from those technologies, came back and then adopted that in some fashion in Android and landed up being really successful, right? And there's so many examples of this. So that's like my more tactical advice. Like, if you have the time and the inclination, go try different things, learn new languages. You don't have to be the experts, but just seeing how those different mental models help shape you will end up paying dividends. So those are my 2 pieces of advice.
Chet.
That was hard to follow. That was all really good. I think a couple of things. So coming right out of school, like if I look back on it, which is a very, very long time, I think one of the weird things in entering the job market is you really have no idea unless, maybe you had some great internships, maybe you went to school after working, whatever. Everybody has a different situation, but I had no idea what working was like. I had no idea what the opportunities were, what the possibilities of different careers and domains were. I thought I'm going to take this math degree and I'm going to go do math. And I got like some random job doing, technical analysis stuff. And it turned out I hated what I was doing, but I learned a lot about what I would rather do. Like that motivated me to say, okay, what were the subjects that I actually took in school that I really enjoyed? And I realized, that computer graphics software thing was pretty cool. Maybe I should go learn some more software. So I went to grad school and basically rebooted to do something new, which I've been essentially doing ever since. But it took that first job that sucked to push me into saying, what would I rather do? So I think my main advice coming right out of school is just do something and dive in, learn it deeply, and then learn more about yourself and about that thing. And then occasionally take a step back and say, would I rather be doing something else? And that leads me to the second stage, which I think is really difficult when you get out of stage, because you do not have all the options. You don't know where to apply. You don't know all the people. They don't know you. Just, take the job, learn the stuff. But eventually you will be able to be more selective. And that drives the thing that I think is most important in most of my career, which is pick jobs based on things that you enjoy doing, right? Like I never go for titles. I never go for, I've taken pay cuts before. I don't go because, this is the company where I need to be to do the follow. Like, no. People ask me like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I'm like, I don't know, in a mirror. I'd never think about the future. Instead, I think about what I like to do. I want to work on intelligent things. I want to work on interesting things. I want to work with smart people, and I want to have fun every day, because we will spend most of our lives working. So isn't it important that we actually enjoy those working hours that we have? It's a little bit harder to do that maybe with the first or second job out of school, but eventually you'll have more a choice. And then you should target the things that you enjoy, because the more you enjoy them, the better you're going to do them. And then the better you're going to do at whatever those things are.
Okay, guess I'm last. Thank you for the depressing thoughts, Chet, that we're spending our whole lives working. I guess my final thoughts on advice I would give to myself in college was to give yourself a bit more grace. When I graduated, I had no idea what I wanted to do, like I mentioned before, and I literally thought my life was over. I was like, my career's over, my life's over. I was literally 20. And, in the moment, especially at like a highly competitive college, it can feel like everything is so serious, and like, if you don't get the best job, you're screwed for the rest of your life. But it's not like that. And I think you can all give yourself a little bit of a break. You're here. You went to a Android panel in the evening, so that's great. That's already that's already more than I was probably doing in college. So you're all on a good path. And I guess just, I would also encourage myself to try more things and get out of my comfort zone. And I wanted to try CS in college, but I was too scared and I didn't do it. So it took me like an extra 4 years to get back to it. So that's my advice.
Perfect. No, I think that's a great note to end on. Don't stress out. Try a bunch of things. Do what you enjoy. Can't go wrong. Okay. Well, with that, to all 4 of you, thank you so much for spending more than an hour with us this evening. It's a very good way to kind of cap the whole Android class. And thanks to all the students who stuck around. And then at some point, I'll post a recording and I'll share that out as well. But yeah, thanks again so much. Have a great evening or a great morning, I guess, Zarah, for you, wherever you are. Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Folks.
Thanks.